northeastern Syria is not just Kurdish. It's actually one of the most ethnically and religiously diverse region. There are Assyrians, there are Orthodox, there are other Christian groups, there are Arab groups, there are Sunnis, and they're all incorporated into the government. But what's interesting is that there's always this discussion of the Kurds in the media outlets. Hillary Clinton saying Trump is abandoning the Kurds. The Kurds are not a monolithic entity. There are other people in the region, and there are people also who have political and even ethnic conflicts with the Kurds. I mean, this is a very complex region. You know, we have to point out the irony actually is that some Kurdish groups were involved in the Armenian genocide. So there's a lot of ethnic conflict. We can't just talk about the Kurds as a big monolithic entity. Also, the Kurds in Iran, Iraq, Syria, and Turkey are different, and they have different political groups. So always the media is like, the U.S. is abandoning the Kurds. Well, the U.S. has abandoned the Kurds multiple times in multiple countries, but it's not just one group, right? So I'm glad someone mentioned that point, that it's not, you know, we can talk about the YPG, the SDF, and those details I don't want to get into because it's too complicated. But the point is, the moral of the story is, the only solution right now is that Kurdish leadership are going to have to make an agreement with the Syrian army to allow the Syrian government to reincorporate this territory, which is 1/4 of the entire territory of Syria, which is being occupied by the U.S. military. 1/4 of the entire country. So the only solution is the U.S. should leave and not allow Turkey to invade. Instead, what should happen is that the Syrian government and the Kurdish leadership and different forces in northeast Syria will have to make an agreement, which is probably what they're going to do. And in fact, in the past year, they've been negotiating together. But the U.S., again, doesn't want that to happen because the U.S. doesn't want to lose this region.
Well, I also want to bring up, you pointed out that it's within the U.S.'s interest and pattern to basically create internal tribal wars, civil wars. So, I mean, a lot of people know this, but like the U.S., who giving money to Saudi Arabia has armed jihadists in Syria that have then fought the CIA. So it's like the U.S. is basically, through its aid to Saudi Arabia, arming jihadis, I believe ISIS, correct me if I'm wrong too, that then fight the CIA-funded Kurds. So it seems to me that, we got to stay in Syria. Again, disclaimer, we're illegally there, but putting that aside, when the U.S. is basically playing this 2-3-dimensional chess and funding on paper fighting itself, but also basically arming jihadists that are fighting the Kurds.
Well, that's a point again that the U.S. doesn't actually care about the Kurds, right? In quotes, the U.S. doesn't.
Did I have that? I had that right.
You're right.
Yeah.
Well, the point, you're right that. So there's a lot to unpack here, and I don't want to get too much into the weeds, but so a 2014 email from Hillary Clinton forwarded to John Podesta that was later published by WikiLeaks.
Are you a Russian traitor?
Obviously. Yeah. But by that notorious Russian Julian Assange, the Australian Russian. Anyway, with this WikiLeaks email published, citing U.S. intelligence services, admits that Saudi Arabia and Qatar were both supporting ISIS. Also, I tweeted recently, the former president of Benin in Africa, he also recently revealed that Saudi Arabia and Qatar were also supporting the ISIS affiliate in West Africa, Boko Haram. So we all know, everyone in the world knows that Saudi Arabia and Qatar, two very close Western allies, have supported ISIS and Al-Qaeda and all of these Salafi jihadi groups. But they don't care because in Syria and in Yemen, those groups are useful. Mainstream media outlets, including the Associated Press, have acknowledged that Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates were supporting Al-Qaeda in Yemen, allied with Al-Qaeda in Yemen, fighting against the Houthis, who were allied with Iran. The U.S. was supporting that policy because the enemy of the enemy is my friend. This is not new, and it's not even it's just something that the U.S. does. I mentioned that the British and French, when they colonized the Middle East, up until really not very recently, right? Up until 50 years ago. From 1916, there's the Sykes-Picot Agreement, and in World War I, the French and the British arbitrarily divide up the region among themselves. They took out a map, and they sat down and said, here is all the territory of the former Ottoman Empire. We get Syria, you get Palestine. You get Jordan, we get they just divided up this region like colonialists do. So this is not a new policy. It's the colonial tactic of divide and conquer. And so the U.S. was supporting Kurdish forces that were fighting ISIS, but then the U.S. was also supporting Saudi Arabia and Qatar, which were supporting ISIS. And at the end of the day, that might seem like an illogical policy. It's only illogical if you think that the U.S. cares about Syrians, which it doesn't. It cares about its own interests. Henry Kissinger famously said, countries don't have principles or morals, they have interests. Mm-hmm. And that is how foreign policy
Especially Henry Kissinger.
Well, of course, is that we don't have allies, we don't have friends, we have interests. The so-called Kurds are not our allies, they're not our friends. They served our interests temporarily, and our interests might have changed, or now they don't serve our interests. So we have to get out of this idea that Hillary Clinton and Chuck Schumer are like, the U.S. is abandoning its allies. They don't believe that either. It's not about allies, it's about interests. Mm-hmm. So the thing is, the Kurds have the Kurds, again we keep saying the Kurds, Kurdish leaders of the YPG, SDF, that allied with the U.S., they're now realizing, once again, that the U.S. is not going to support its allies. Mm-hmm. And it's not the first time this has happened. This happened in Iraq, when the U.S. encouraged Kurdish groups in Iraq who are different from Syrian Kurds. They speak a different dialect. The U.S. encouraged Kurdish groups in Iraq to rise up against Saddam 2 different times, and then just let them be slaughtered by Saddam. So this is not new. But again, I know there's a lot of complex details involved in this. For people who are listening, who are just joining, the solution is simple. And I think, again, as bad as Trump is, his instinct to want to get out of Syria, that instinct is something we should actually encourage. The U.S. should get out of Syria, but the U.S. is actually not getting out of Syria. It made an agreement with Turkey to allow Turkey to once again invade, which Turkey has done multiple times in the past several years, and the U.S. is simply moving its troops. The only solution is U.S. out of Syria, Turkey out of Syria, which is illegal international law, and these groups in the northeast need to make a political agreement with the Syrian government to finally end the war, because in the majority of Syria, the war is over.
Right.
But of course, the U.S. is still bleeding the country up until the end.
So to put a bow on this particular topic, I mean, all I hear in the corporate media is this is going to rebirth ISIS. And it's basically like, we left Iraq and ISIS happened, and now we're leaving Syria, and it's going to basically regenerate ISIS.
Well, again, the U.S. is actually not leaving Syria, even though they should. They keep saying that, but Trump is just moving the troops. The New York Times, I just stress, the New York Times said that they're not leaving. They should leave, but they're not. Anyway, but no, this is the excuse always used. Oh, we have to stay there or ISIS is going to come back. ISIS was not defeated by the U.S. The U.S. helped support Kurdish groups, which did play a role in fighting ISIS in certain areas, but ISIS was defeated in large regions, not just in the Kurdish regions, by the Syrian army, by Iran, the boogeyman Iran, by Iraq and the Popular Mobilization Forces in Iraq, the Hashid, PMFs, which are backed by Iran, and by Hezbollah. Now, we're supposed to believe that all of these groups are evil boogeymen, of course, because they refuse to recognize Israel, because they're fighting Israel, because they go against U.S. interests, because they are fighting Saudi Arabia. So we're supposed to believe that somehow they are the bad guys. But Saudi Arabia supported ISIS, a major U.S. proxy in the region. Meanwhile, Iran, the Iranian sympathetic Iraqi government, and Hezbollah and the Syrian army all played a leading role in defeating ISIS, not just in Syria. Here's another quick example. In Lebanon, a tiny country, extremely diverse country like Syria, many Christian groups, Armenians, Catholics, Orthodox, Shia, Sunni, very diverse. Inside Lebanon, there were border towns on the border of Syria that were being taken over by ISIS. And the Lebanese army was so weak that the Lebanese government allied with Hezbollah, which is a legal political party with an armed wing inside Lebanon, in the Lebanese parliament, democratically elected. We're told that they're all terrorists. The Lebanese government and military allied with Hezbollah together to fight against ISIS. We're supposed to believe that Hezbollah are Mike Pompeo called them the world's worst terrorists. Meanwhile, U.S. allies are supporting ISIS. U.S. enemies are fighting ISIS. And they can defeat ISIS. The U.S., no one needs the U.S. to defeat ISIS. The U.S. is using this as an excuse. Again, the U.S., whose allies and intelligence services fueled ISIS for years, this is always an excuse to justify continued military occupation, once again, of the most oil-rich region in Syria. Like, I mean, it's just like...
And also, by the way, there's no mention... Trump has like tripled Obama's drone program. So we're creating enemies pretty much all over the Middle East. So leaving Syria, even if we stay in Syria, it's not like there's not other groups forming that want to attack America, because we don't actually think about long-term consequences of droning half the world, bombing school buses in Yemen, bombing weddings in Yemen, and God knows where else. So it's not like the only terror threat is in Syria. But I think, to put a bow on it, the bottom line is, whether we should leave or not, you can't just willy-nilly, without congressional approval, go in wherever you want. And I think the bottom line is, I think we could agree, Assad is a brutal dictator, but at the same time, it's his country. Syria has their own sovereignty.
Well, but also the Syrian government is not just Assad. Of course,
Right.
The Syrian government is very authoritarian. So is every country in the region.
Mm-hmm.
And it's always apples and oranges. We're always comparing the Syrian government to the French government or something, which is a colonial government. No, Syria is a formerly colonized country that has never had a chance to be able to self-govern. Like I mentioned, in 1916, it was stolen from the Ottoman Empire and handed over to the French Empire and colonized by the French until the 1950s and 60s, and they had a national liberation struggle to free themselves from colonialism, and then they've had a series of wars ever since. They've never been able to exercise sovereignty in this extremely violent, turbulent region, which is still partially colonized. Mm-hmm. So, yeah, the Syrian government is authoritarian, and you know what also is authoritarian? Its neighbor, Jordan. Mm-hmm. Meanwhile, its neighbor, Jordan, is a monarchy. Syria, for all of its weaknesses and problems...
I think I'm more of a...
For all of its weaknesses, Syria is a secular republic where women have equal rights, and, this is sometimes used by Islamophobes, and, screw Islamophobes. We shouldn't encourage Islamophobia, but it's true that in Syria, it's one of the only countries in the region where women have completely equal rights under law. They certainly don't in Saudi Arabia, where women can go out and, at night and have, party and have fun. And, again, that, even though Islamophobes say that, that's still true, and it's an important thing. It is a fact about Syria. And meanwhile, the Islamophobes are actually supporting the war in Syria, and the Islamophobes are actually allied with the jihadis to destroy the secular state of Syria that allows for protections for all religious and ethnic minorities. So, regardless, yes, Syria is a police state. It's an authoritarian state. But again, so is Jordan. The difference is Syria...
So is Saudi Arabia.
Yeah, Saudi Arabia is one of the most authoritarian countries on earth. And also, Lebanon is a democracy, but Lebanon's a failed state. And Lebanon, the government is so weak, they don't pick up the garbage sometimes. And there was a big protest movement. So the point is that in the region, of course, yes, there are a lot of issues, but the U.S. and its allies, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Turkey, they don't care actually about the fact that Syria is a police state. Turkey's a police state. It's not about it's the fact that they have a secular, independent government that refuses to recognize Israel, that supports Palestinian groups and Lebanese resistance groups fighting Israel, that is allied with Iran, that is against Saudi Arabia. That is why it's geopolitical. It's not because of freedom and democracy.
Hope you enjoyed that last video. Hop on over to statusquo.com, where you can sign up for our email list and become a member for as low as $5 to $10 a month. Membership is how we grow. That's statusquo.com/join. And remember, join our email list so we can grow the revolution with you.
Status quo.